It all began on a day when the air itself felt heavy, like the city was carrying a secret. The parking lot of Hamilton Industries shimmered under the blistering heat. Rows of sleek black cars lined up like soldiers ready for inspection. The building towered above, a monument to wealth and power, its mirrored glass reflecting the skyline as if to remind everyone who truly owned the horizon. Among the rows of polished sedans and gleaming sports cars stood a man who didn't belong, Derek Carter. His coveralls were worn thin, stained with oil that no amount of scrubbing could erase. His boots were scuffed, his knuckles cracked and raw. He bent over the hood of a stalled luxury coupe that coughed its last breath right in front of the executive entrance. Engines don't care about money, and neither does fate. Derek's presence turned heads, not because people admired his skill, but because in that kingdom of tailored suits and silk ties, his very existence was a reminder that not everything could be bought. Executives walked past, whispering to each other, their polished shoes tapping against the marble like impatient clocks. Some smirked, others wrinkled their noses at the scent of sweat and grease that clung to him. Then came Victoria Hamilton, the CEO, the woman whose name alone carried weight in the financial pages of every newspaper. Her white suit was so sharp it could cut glass, and her heels echoed like gunfire across the concrete. She didn't just arrive. She descended like royalty surveying her domain. A small entourage of assistants and executives trailed behind her, carrying tablets, iced coffees, and an air of unquestionable obedience. Victoria stopped. Her sunglasses reflected Derek's bent figure like a distorted shadow. She tilted her head, her lips curling into a smirk that had humiliated board members, rivals, and now her new target. "This," she said, her voice carrying effortlessly across the parking lot, "is the mechanic they sent?" Her entourage chuckled, the kind of laughter that seeks approval. Derek didn't flinch. His hands moved steadily, the sound of tools clinking against metal becoming his shield. But Victoria wasn't satisfied. She stepped closer, her perfume slicing through the stale summer air. "Tell you what," she said, her tone dripping with mockery, each word deliberate. "Fix this engine, and I'll marry you." The group erupted. Laughter spilled across the parking lot like champagne at a victory party. One executive doubled over, slapping his knee. Another pulled out his phone, whispering, "Get this on video. Nobody's gonna believe it." For a moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. Derek straightened slowly, wiping his hands on a rag that was already blackened. His eyes met Victoria's through the glare of her sunglasses. Calm, steady, unshaken. He didn't laugh. He didn't argue. He just nodded once, a silent agreement, as if her words weren't an insult, but a contract. And that silence, it unnerved them more than any outburst could have. The laughter faltered, fading into awkward chuckles. Victoria arched an eyebrow, but beneath the layers of control, something flickered. She didn't expect that response. Here's the thing about humiliation. People think it crushes. Sometimes it does. But sometimes it plants a seed. And if the soil is deep enough, if the fire inside burns hot enough, that seed grows into something unstoppable. And right there, under the blazing sun and the mocking eyes of the wealthy, Derek Carter decided he wasn't going to let their laughter define him. He was going to let his work speak. And when it did, it wouldn't just silence the laughter, it would shake the ground they stood on. What happened next turned a parking lot insult into a story no one in that building would ever forget. Before I reveal what Derek did next, the moment that turned humiliation into pure shock, make sure you subscribe to the channel, tap the like button, and leave a comment about what you would have done if someone dared you the way Victoria dared Derek. You don't want to miss how this story unfolds. The laughter still echoed faintly in the parking lot, though by now it had lost its strength. Derek had gone back to the engine, his movements unhurried, precise, almost ritualistic. He treated the machine as if it were a wounded creature, listening to the faintest rattle, feeling every vibration through his fingertips. To the executives, it looked like a man tinkering with bolts. To Derek, it was a dialogue, a conversation between him and the broken heart of a car that everyone else had already dismissed. Victoria leaned against the polished hood of another vehicle, arms crossed, watching him like a queen tolerating the performance of a court jester. She was used to being entertained. Deals, negotiations, power struggles, they were her games, and people bent to her rules. This was supposed to be just another scene in which she laughed, her entourage laughed, and the world reminded her she was untouchable. But something about Derek's calmness unsettled her. He didn't rise to the bait. He didn't stumble over her words. And more importantly, he didn't seem to need her approval. That, for a woman who built empires on dominance, was unfamiliar territory. The minutes stretched. The sun dipped slightly lower, but the heat still pressed on every surface, making sweat bead along foreheads and necks. Assistants shifted uncomfortably, whispering about deadlines and missed meetings. Yet none dared to leave. Curiosity held them there, tethered to the scene like moths to a flame. "Do you even know what you're doing?" one executive finally asked, breaking the silence. His voice dripped with mockery, but beneath it, there was impatience. He wanted resolution, either a failure to laugh at or a miracle to scoff away. Derek didn't answer. He tightened a bolt, adjusted a wire, and leaned closer to listen. The silence was no accident. It was a statement. Words weren't going to win this battle, results would. Victoria tilted her head, her smirk sharpening. "You know, it's cute," she said. "Watching you pretend you can fix something this complex. These engines aren't like the junkyard cars you're probably used to. This is precision, engineering, art." Derek finally spoke. His voice was low, steady, unshaken. "Engines don't care how much they cost. They all bleed the same when you push them too hard." For a moment there was silence. Not because his words were particularly poetic, but because they carried weight. He spoke like a man who had spent his life with machines, who knew their temperaments better than most people knew themselves. It was the kind of statement that exposed a truth too plain to argue with. The entourage chuckled nervously, but the laughter didn't land the way it had before. Victoria's jaw tightened, almost imperceptibly. She adjusted her sunglasses and turned away as if the heat, not his words, had made her uncomfortable. Then Derek pulled the ignition cable back into place, checked the fuel line, and straightened. His hands, blackened with oil, moved with the confidence of someone who wasn't guessing. He looked at the car as if daring it to prove him wrong. He slid into the driver's seat, turned the key, and for a heartbeat, nothing happened. The silence was crushing. The executives grinned, ready to pounce, their laughter already building in their throats. Then the engine roared. Not a weak, trembling gasp, but a deep, thunderous growl, as if the car had been waiting for Derek's touch all along. The sound echoed off the glass walls of Hamilton Industries, shaking the air itself. It was more than just an engine starting, it was a declaration. Every head turned. The executives froze, their grins dying in an instant. The laughter that had filled the lot earlier seemed ridiculous now, almost shameful. Even Victoria's smirk faltered. She hadn't expected that. Derek stepped out, wiping his hands casually, as though what had just happened was routine. But his eyes, those calm, steady eyes, met hers again. And for the first time, she looked away. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was heavy. It was the kind of silence that demanded respect, whether anyone wanted to give it or not. And that was only the beginning. The roar of the engine still lingered in the air, vibrating through the polished concrete of the parking lot, as if Derek's hands had awakened a force the building itself hadn't felt in years. The executives' laughter had vanished entirely, replaced by an uncomfortable hum of murmurs, clicks of phones, and shifting weight on expensive leather shoes. Everyone felt it, the shift in power, subtle but unmistakable. Victoria Hamilton's heels clicked sharply against the pavement as she took a few steps toward the car, her face an unreadable mask. She was used to winning, to controlling situations with a glance, a word, a carefully timed smile. But today the rules had changed. Derek hadn't just fixed the car. He had rewired the entire dynamic. He had taken the pedestal of mockery she had so comfortably perched on and cracked it beneath her own feet. "Impressive," she said finally, her voice tight but measured. "But don't think this means you get a free pass." Derek didn't flinch. His eyes, still steady, met hers. "I don't need a pass. I just do my job." The simplicity of his words, the sheer honesty in them, sent a ripple through the crowd. There was no arrogance, no desperate need for approval, no showmanship. Just skill, experience, and quiet confidence. It was almost shocking how much weight that carried in a world obsessed with appearances and status. Whispers started to spread like wildfire. One executive nudged another, pointing subtly. "Did you see that? He didn't just fix it. He owned it." Another murmured, "I think the CEO just got schooled." The tension in the air was palpable, a mixture of awe, envy, and disbelief. Victoria's assistant, a young man named Peter, tried to cover her reaction. "Ma'am, perhaps we should..." He trailed off, realizing no words could undo what had just happened. Victoria, for her part, didn't respond immediately. She adjusted her sunglasses, the cool mask she always wore now struggling to hide a flicker of something. Maybe irritation, maybe respect. For Derek, none of this mattered. The world's judgments, their whispers, their smirks, they were noise. His focus had always been on precision, on results, on proving his capabilities to himself, not to anyone else. But he couldn't deny a small part of him acknowledged the weight of the moment. The very air around him seemed heavier, charged with the recognition that skill could command attention without a single boast. The executives began to talk among themselves, quietly at first, then louder. Who is this guy? Where did he learn that? I can't believe she made a bet like that. Questions filled the air, but no one dared speak directly to Derek. Not yet. They were caught in the tension he had created, trapped in their own assumptions about power, race, and hierarchy. Victoria finally spoke again, louder this time, cutting through the murmurs. "All right, enough," she said, though the authority in her voice was less sharp than usual. "You've proven your point. But remember, this doesn't change the rules around here." Derek nodded politely. Understood. Her words, meant to reclaim dominance, fell flat. The room's energy had shifted irreversibly. People were starting to see Derek not just as a mechanic, but as someone who refused to be diminished. His skill had become a statement, a quiet rebellion against entitlement and arrogance. And somewhere deep inside Victoria, a realization stirred. For the first time in her life, someone had bested her not by challenge or confrontation, but by quiet competence. She had underestimated the man, and the repercussions of that miscalculation were only beginning to unfold. Meanwhile, across the lot, Peter, the assistant, whispered under his breath, unable to hide his excitement. "You just watched him embarrass the CEO, and she knows it." Derek, as usual, didn't respond. He simply returned his tools to the cart, wiped his hands, and walked away, leaving the roar of the engine as the only proof of his triumph. That roar wasn't just a sound. It was a message, one that would echo through Hamilton Industries longer than anyone could anticipate. By the next morning, the story had already taken on a life of its own. Hamilton Industries was a glass and steel fortress, but even walls made of concrete and pride can't contain whispers, and whispers, once set free, have a way of multiplying faster than anyone expects. The parking lot incident wasn't just a tale. It was a lesson, a spectacle, a disruption in the usual rhythm of power. In the sleek conference rooms on the top floors, executives who had once laughed at Derek now gathered in tight clusters, speaking in hushed tones. "Did you see the guy?" one asked, tapping his tablet nervously. "I mean, he fixed it, just like that, without breaking a sweat." Another shook his head. "And she didn't know what to say. The CEO, she's not used to anyone just ignoring her." The murmurs weren't limited to idle curiosity. People began retelling the story in meetings, over coffee, even on calls with clients. Every version added small flourishes, exaggerations, until Derek's calm defiance became a legendary moment, a symbol of skill prevailing over arrogance. Meanwhile, Victoria sat in her office, the usual view of the skyline failing to provide any comfort. Her assistant, Peter, entered cautiously, holding a tablet like it might explode in his hands. "Ma'am, the story's circulating. Everyone's talking about the mechanic from yesterday." Victoria didn't look up immediately. She tapped a pen against her desk, a rhythm that had always helped her think clearly. But today, even that sound seemed foreign. "What do you mean, everyone?" she asked, her voice sharp, but laced with tension. Peter hesitated. "The engineers, the middle management, even the board members. Some clients called. They want to know who he is, what experience he has. And, well, they're impressed." Victoria's eyes narrowed. She had always built her reputation on being untouchable, the one who commanded respect, the one who set the rules. And now, some greasy-handed mechanic with nothing but skill and quiet confidence had disrupted that narrative in seconds. She felt the unfamiliar stirrings of unease, like a tremor under her feet she couldn't simply crush with authority. She rose from her chair and walked to the window, staring out at the city. The engines of commerce below continued their relentless hum, oblivious to the small but significant battle that had just taken place in her parking lot. But she couldn't ignore it. The incident was spreading, gaining momentum, and no corporate memo could contain the story now. Back on the shop floor, Derek continued his routine. He didn't know about the whispers, didn't care. For him, work was work, skill was skill, and validation was never needed from those who doubted. Yet, slowly, he began to notice subtle changes. The way people paused to watch him, the nods of approval from colleagues who had once ignored him, the quiet respect forming in spaces he had never occupied before. And Victoria? She couldn't escape the ripple effect. Emails arrived from departments asking for explanations, employees subtly questioning decisions, and small cracks in her authority began to show. The incident with Derek had shifted something intangible but critical: perception. In a world where image was everything, a single moment of humility from a subordinate had sown doubt in the highest office. Her smirk, once a weapon, now felt brittle. The narrative was no longer hers to control. And Derek? He remained unaware, untouched by politics, impervious to the whispers, simply doing what he did best. The storm was building, and neither Derek nor Victoria fully understood just how far it would reach. But the stage was set. The laughter had ended, the whispers had begun, and the game had changed. By mid-morning, the tension at Hamilton Industries had thickened into something tangible, something you could almost slice through with a knife. Derek Carter moved through the facility with the same quiet confidence that had earned him that fateful glance from Victoria the day before. He wasn't aware of the storm swirling behind him, the subtle undercurrents of whispers and glances, or the shift in the balance of power he had unintentionally initiated. For him, it was just another day at work, another engine to fix, another challenge to solve. Yet, as he walked past clusters of employees, he began to notice their reactions. People stepped aside to let him pass, nodding slightly, murmuring compliments under their breaths. Some of the younger engineers even lingered longer than necessary, sneaking looks, curious about the man who had so effortlessly dismantled a narrative of arrogance with nothing but skill and calm. Derek's focus didn't waver, but an unspoken awareness settled in. His actions had consequences beyond the physical realm of engines and bolts. Meanwhile, Victoria was pacing in her corner office, her fingers drumming against the polished surface of her mahogany desk. The reflection of the city's skyline in the floor-to-ceiling windows seemed almost mocking, a reminder that control, while powerful, was never absolute. She had built her empire on precision, on perception, on the art of commanding without question. But one man had pierced that armor. Derek had done what no memo, no reprimand, no intimidation could achieve. He had shifted the narrative. She called Peter into the office, her assistant who had been with her long enough to understand the subtleties of her moods. "Get me a list," she said sharply. "Everyone who witnessed yesterday. I need to know how far this anomaly has spread." Peter hesitated, then nodded, quickly moving to fulfill the task. Victoria's mind raced. The problem wasn't the engine, it was the image. The incident had undermined her authority, challenged the hierarchy she had so meticulously constructed. People were talking, speculating, and in a corporate culture like this, speculation had power. It could undermine deals, shake confidence, and in a world driven by perception, perception was reality. Back in the shop, Derek paused, wiping his hands on a rag. Something had changed in the atmosphere. Conversations paused as he entered the room. Eyes followed his every move. It wasn't just curiosity. It was respect, tinged with a quiet awe. He could feel the weight of it, a subtle energy that shifted the way people interacted around him. Yet he remained undistracted, focused solely on the task in front of him. For Derek, skill and integrity had always spoken louder than words, and now they were speaking volumes. Victoria, on the other hand, was beginning to strategize. She couldn't allow this narrative to solidify. The world watched for weakness, and weakness, even perceived, could be fatal in her position. She had faced competitors, rivals, boardroom betrayals, but she had never faced the quiet defiance of someone who had nothing to lose and everything to prove. That made Derek unpredictable, dangerous in a way she hadn't anticipated. She picked up the phone, her tone icy but controlled. "Schedule a meeting," she instructed. "I want the man in front of me, now." She paused, thinking through her words, the questions she would ask, the tests she would administer. She needed to reclaim the narrative, assert dominance, not through fear but through strategy. As Derek continued his work, unaware of the meeting being arranged, the undercurrent of tension in Hamilton Industries grew stronger. The employees felt it, the executives felt it, and Victoria felt it most acutely. The engine's roar had become a catalyst, igniting something far larger than anyone had predicted. And in that quiet storm of glances, whispers, and calculated decisions, one thing was clear: the dynamics had shifted. Derek Carter had done more than fix an engine. He had rewritten the rules of engagement, and Victoria Hamilton was only beginning to realize the challenge that lay ahead. The conference room was pristine, intimidating in its perfection. Floor-to-ceiling glass walls reflected the sunlight in sharp, geometric patterns, and the polished table stretched like a runway of authority. Chairs lined up perfectly on either side, ready for deals, negotiations, or confrontations. Derek Carter, unassuming yet confident, entered the room with a calm that contrasted sharply against the tension hanging in the air. He didn't glance around, didn't comment on the luxury or the meticulous order. It was all irrelevant to him. Victoria Hamilton was already there, standing at the head of the table like a general surveying the battlefield. Her white suit seemed even sharper under the fluorescent lights, her heels echoing with each step as she circled the table. The smirk was back, but this time it was tempered with curiosity and caution. This was her domain, yet somehow, the man who had repaired her prized engine the day before had unsettled the very foundation of her authority. "Derek Carter," she began, voice controlled but firm. "I wanted to meet you personally." He nodded slightly. "Good morning, Ms. Hamilton." His tone was polite, neutral, but it carried a subtle confidence that made the words weigh heavier than they should have. Victoria gestured for him to sit, though she herself remained standing. "Have a seat," she said, though her tone suggested the offer was as much a test as it was a courtesy. Derek did, placing his hands on the table in front of him, not fidgeting, not flinching, just waiting for her to continue. "I must admit," she said, leaning slightly forward, "I didn't expect yesterday's outcome, not from someone in your position, not from someone I assumed would be, well, average." Derek's expression didn't change. "Engines don't care about position," he said simply. "They respond to understanding, patience, and skill. That's all." A flicker of irritation crossed Victoria's face, quickly masked by her professional composure. She adjusted her sunglasses, placing them atop her head, and leaned against the edge of the table. "You have a remarkable way of turning a simple act into a spectacle," she said. "And yet, here you are, calm, collected, completely unaffected by the attention you've received." Derek looked directly at her, steady as ever. "Attention doesn't fix engines. Skill does." A silence filled the room. It wasn't awkward, it was tense, like a drawn bowstring ready to snap. The kind of silence that forces a confrontation not through words but through presence, through the quiet acknowledgement of competence meeting ego. Victoria circled the table slowly, her heels clicking with deliberate precision. "Do you understand?" she asked. "The implications of what you've done? People are talking. Clients, executives, even the board, they've noticed your performance. You've become a story." Derek's calm eyes didn't waver. "I didn't intend to make a story. I just did my job." Her smirk tightened, but she didn't back down. "Doing your job, huh? In my world, doing your job is expected. Excellence is rare. And yet, somehow you've made both seem effortless." He leaned back slightly, a subtle gesture of confidence. "Excellence is about focus, about ignoring distractions, about letting results speak louder than words. Anyone can try to humiliate someone. They can't stop skill from proving itself." Victoria paused, studying him. There was no arrogance in his tone, no hidden agenda, no attempt to charm her. Just quiet, unshakable certainty. And for a woman who thrived on control, certainty in someone else was a dangerous thing. "You're remarkable, Derek," she said finally, her voice a mixture of admiration and restrained irritation. "But remarkable doesn't make you untouchable. I'm sure you'll find that in this company, influence has a weight that skill alone can't balance." Derek nodded, his expression calm. "Then let's see if skill and patience can outweigh influence." And with that, the room felt smaller, the tension heavier, and the game between them fully ignited. Neither had yet revealed all their cards, but the first move had been made, and both knew the battle had only just begun. The days following the engine incident were electric. Hamilton Industries hummed with an energy that wasn't entirely corporate. It was a ripple effect, subtle yet unstoppable, like a stone dropped into a still pond. Derek moved through the halls with the quiet authority of someone who had done nothing extraordinary yet altered the rules simply by being competent. Employees who had previously ignored him now paused in hallways, whispering under their breaths, exchanging furtive glances. His reputation had preceded him, and in a company that thrived on hierarchy and appearances, that was dangerous. Victoria noticed the shift immediately. Her office, once a fortress of unquestioned control, now felt exposed. Emails requesting Derek's expertise multiplied. Meetings that had once flowed without interruption now faltered as managers and team leaders hesitated, unsure whether to override his methods or defer to his proven skill. The subtle loyalty of colleagues, once beneath her radar, began to coalesce quietly around Derek. The realization hit her like cold water. Influence and authority could be challenged, not by rebellion, but by competence, and the most dangerous kind was quiet, unassuming, and consistent. Derek, of course, remained unaware of the machinations forming behind him. He focused on the work, the engines, the systems, the minute details others overlooked. But he began to notice subtle nods, fleeting gestures of support, and small acts of deference from colleagues who had previously walked past him without acknowledgement. It was not overt, not dramatic, but it carried weight. Allies were being formed quietly, drawn by respect and shared understanding rather than fear or hierarchy. Victoria, sensing the momentum slipping, began strategizing. She called discreet meetings with key executives, seeking to reassert control. "We cannot allow a narrative like this to take root," she told them, her tone measured but firm. "Competence is admirable, but it cannot undermine authority. Make sure people understand where the boundaries lie." Her words, meant to intimidate, had mixed results. While some executives nodded, others hesitated, unsure how to intervene without further drawing attention to Derek. The man's calm defiance had exposed a fracture in the carefully constructed illusion of command, and cracks in the system, once revealed, are not easily repaired. Meanwhile, Derek continued his work, oblivious to the network of glances, whispers, and silent endorsements forming around him. Yet the very energy of the office shifted as he passed. Employees who had once avoided him now subtly mirrored his actions, adopting his methods, emulating his focus. What had begun as admiration for skill was evolving into a quiet allegiance, one that bypassed traditional hierarchies and left Victoria feeling the tension in every room she entered. One afternoon, as Derek fine-tuned a complex machine in the corner of the floor, he noticed Peter, Victoria's assistant, lingering nearby. Peter's expression was guarded but curious, a mixture of hesitation and admiration. Derek offered a simple nod of acknowledgement. No words were exchanged, but the gesture was enough. Peter returned to his tasks with a renewed perspective, a subtle shift in allegiance forming in his mind. Victoria, observing from her office window, felt the change palpably. The narrative was no longer hers to control. Derek had become a focal point for attention, respect, and curiosity. Every whisper about him reinforced a truth she had yet to confront openly. In a world built on appearances, one man's skill and quiet confidence could erode authority faster than any overt rebellion. The tension between them was now a living entity, growing in the spaces between meetings, emails, and casual hallway encounters. Each move Derek made, each silent nod from a colleague, was a reminder that the balance had shifted. Victoria knew she had to act, but how do you contain a force that refuses to acknowledge boundaries? The game had escalated from a single moment of humiliation to a slow-burning challenge of influence, loyalty, and perception. Derek didn't seek confrontation, yet confrontation was inevitable. And Victoria, no matter how strategic or controlled, had realized one undeniable fact. This man was rewriting the rules, and the office would never feel the same again. The office floor buzzed with a different kind of energy that morning. Hamilton Industries had a project in motion, one of the most delicate, high-stakes contracts in recent memory. A sophisticated engine prototype, months in development, was faltering under the weight of its own complexity. Teams had tried for weeks, running calculations, simulations, and repairs, yet nothing produced the precise results required. The board demanded perfection, and perfection had a name: Derek Carter. Victoria watched from her office, her arms crossed, her gaze sharp. This was her chance to test him, to push him to his limits, and perhaps reclaim the narrative she felt slipping through her fingers. "If he fails," she muttered under her breath, "then the lesson will be clear. Authority matters." But the unease in her chest betrayed her. What if he didn't fail? What if his quiet competence shattered her carefully constructed dominance further? Derek arrived at the prototype station with a calm that seemed almost impossible in the midst of rising tension. The engineers gave him space, watching as he methodically examined the engine, his fingers dancing over the complex machinery with precision. No hesitation, no arrogance, just pure skill. Every movement spoke volumes. He knew what he was doing, and he had no intention of letting fear or expectation dictate his performance. Victoria stepped out of her office, her heels echoing on the polished floor. She approached slowly, measuring the man who had upended her world. "Derek," she said, voice smooth yet commanding. "This is a test. The prototype is delicate. A single mistake and it's worthless. Do you understand the stakes?" Derek nodded. "I understand," he replied simply, his calm tone a stark contrast to the tension around him. "Mistakes don't come from understanding. They come from rushing, from fear, from distraction. None of those are present here." A ripple of murmurs ran through the gathered engineers. His words, though simple, carried weight, reassurance, and authority. In a room full of experts who had struggled for weeks, confidence had a contagious effect. They began assisting him, instinctively falling into patterns Derek initiated, following his lead rather than their own instructions. Victoria watched, a mixture of fascination and frustration building inside her. Every adjustment Derek made seemed effortless, every calibration precise. And yet, beneath her professional demeanor, she felt a growing unease. Here was a man who didn't seek recognition, didn't bow to authority, didn't play politics. Yet he commanded respect with the sheer force of competence. Hours passed. The prototype began to respond as Derek had promised. The engineers, initially skeptical, now exchanged glances of disbelief and admiration. The machine, once stubborn and unpredictable, now ran smoothly, performing beyond the limits anyone had expected. Every hum, every calibrated motion, was a testament to Derek's skill, to his patience, and to his refusal to be intimidated. Victoria stepped closer, her hands clasped, her eyes studying his every movement. "Remarkable," she said softly, a statement laced with both admiration and a hint of challenge. "But can you maintain this consistency under pressure? This isn't just a machine, it's a statement. One mistake and the consequences are massive." Derek didn't look up. "Pressure is measured by how you respond, not by how others perceive it," he said. "The machine doesn't care about your expectations. It responds to understanding and precision." The air in the room thickened. For the first time, Victoria felt uncertain, challenged not by words or defiance, but by the undeniable truth of skill meeting crisis with calm mastery. Derek was more than a mechanic. He was a force that could not be swayed by intimidation, status, or authority. By the time the prototype completed its tests flawlessly, the room was silent, not in fear, but in awe. Engineers who had doubted themselves and Derek now looked on with respect, while Victoria's smirk had faded into a tight line of contemplation. This man, this quiet, unassuming mechanic, had once again shifted the balance. And she knew, deep down, the next moves in their game would have to be calculated with far more care. Victoria Hamilton returned to her office that evening, the city lights flickering like distant stars outside her floor-to-ceiling windows. The hum of Hamilton Industries below felt different, charged, restless. Derek Carter had completed the prototype flawlessly, and while she outwardly maintained her composure, inwardly a quiet storm of frustration and calculation brewed. Her authority, while intact on paper, had been undermined in ways that couldn't be easily erased. She picked up her phone and began calling key executives individually, each conversation carefully measured. "We need to ensure the narrative remains balanced," she instructed, choosing her words with precision. "Competence is admirable, but it cannot overshadow leadership. Make it clear where authority lies." Yet even as she spoke, she sensed the difficulty of enforcing compliance. Derek's calm defiance had inspired a subtle loyalty among the staff, a loyalty based not on fear or ambition, but on respect. And respect, once earned, was far harder to manipulate. Meanwhile, Derek moved through the building with the same quiet assurance that had begun to unsettle her. He noticed the small gestures, engineers pausing to watch him, technicians asking for his advice, colleagues quietly deferring to his judgment. None of it was overt, none of it demanded acknowledgement. It simply happened. He had no need to dominate the narrative. The truth of his skill and consistency spoke for itself. Victoria, sensing her direct methods had been partially neutralized, began employing more subtle tactics. She scheduled impromptu meetings, rearranged project assignments, and even created scenarios designed to challenge Derek's patience and problem-solving skills under pressure. Each move was deliberate, aimed at testing him without exposing her own unease. But Derek, focused and disciplined, navigated each challenge with ease, turning every potential pressure point into an opportunity for quiet demonstration of competence. The subtlety of Victoria's strategy only made Derek's calm mastery more visible to the rest of the staff. Employees who once hesitated now observed with admiration how he handled sudden demands, unexpected complications, and even the thinly veiled challenges Victoria tried to insert into his day. Each success strengthened the bonds of respect forming quietly around him. Allies emerged not because Derek sought influence, but because skill and integrity had a gravitational pull that could not be ignored. Victoria watched from a distance, a mixture of fascination and irritation simmering beneath her composed exterior. Each demonstration of Derek's reliability was a reminder that control was not absolute and that respect could not be commanded. It had to be earned. And in this environment, Derek was earning it faster than she could contain. The tension between them grew in complexity. It was no longer a simple challenge of authority versus defiance. It had evolved into a layered dance of observation, subtle strategy, and calculated responses. Victoria's tactics were precise, her intentions clear, yet Derek's focus and quiet confidence rendered many of her efforts less effective than she anticipated. Even as she plotted her next move, Victoria could not ignore the emerging truth. Derek's presence had shifted the cultural dynamics of Hamilton Industries. The quiet allegiance forming around him, the subtle admiration in colleagues' gestures, the ripple effect of his competence. It was undeniable. And the more she tried to control it, the more apparent it became that he was not a man to be intimidated, outmaneuvered, or diminished. By the end of the day, as the office emptied and the fluorescent lights dimmed, Victoria sat in her office, contemplating her next strategy. Derek, oblivious to the planning and schemes swirling above him, continued his work, leaving a trail of silent respect in his wake. The battle for influence had entered a new phase, one defined not by overt confrontation, but by subtle tests, quiet observation, and the growing realization that skill, when paired with integrity, could rival authority itself. The following morning, Hamilton Industries hummed with its usual rhythm, but beneath the surface, a new tension simmered, one orchestrated with precision by Victoria Hamilton herself. She had spent the night planning a subtle challenge, one designed not to embarrass Derek outright, but to test his patience, ingenuity, and ability to navigate pressure without breaking his calm. It was the kind of test only a strategist like Victoria could devise, and she was eager to see if he could handle it. Derek arrived at the shop as usual, his presence unassuming yet commanding in its quiet confidence. The engineers were already waiting, the prototype they had been perfecting the previous day now surrounded by new complications Victoria had introduced overnight. Components were misaligned, systems were intentionally destabilized, and the instructions for testing had been modified to be deliberately confusing. It was subtle sabotage, not malicious, but enough to require focus, precision, and critical thinking to navigate. Victoria, observing from her office above, felt a thrill of anticipation. This was the first time she had engineered a scenario specifically to pressure him, and she wanted to see how he would react. Would he crack under the weight of expectation? Would the quiet defiance that had unsettled her finally falter? Derek approached the engine, his hands moving over the machinery as though he could hear its pulse. The changes were immediately noticeable, yet he didn't flinch. Where others might panic or blame, he assessed, adjusted, and recalibrated. His movements were deliberate, measured, almost meditative, a dance of intellect and intuition. The engineers watched in awe, some whispering among themselves, others holding their breath. Victoria descended to the shop floor, her heels clicking softly against the polished concrete. She positioned herself at a distance, arms crossed, observing closely. "Interesting," she said under her breath, almost to herself. "Let's see how he handles this." Minutes stretched into an hour. Derek methodically worked through the challenges, addressing each complication with a combination of skill, logic, and patience. Every misalignment, every unexpected malfunction, became an opportunity for him to demonstrate competence, adaptability, and calm under pressure. The subtle sabotage Victoria had orchestrated, intended to destabilize him, instead highlighted his extraordinary abilities. The tension in the room was palpable. Engineers who had initially feared failure now leaned in closer, captivated by Derek's methodical approach. Even Victoria's usual allies found themselves holding back, uncertain whether to intervene or allow him to complete the task. Each step he took, each decision he made, seemed to expand his silent influence, reshaping the hierarchy without a single word of confrontation. Finally, Derek stepped back, wiped his hands, and nodded. The prototype, once unstable and unpredictable, now hummed perfectly. Its systems synchronized flawlessly, its performance exceeding expectations. The room fell silent, not in doubt, but in awe. Derek had taken a scenario designed to challenge and unsettle him and transformed it into proof of his mastery. Victoria stood frozen, her strategic plan having backfired in the most spectacular way. The subtle challenge, intended to assert her authority, had only reinforced Derek's competence and amplified the quiet loyalty of those around him. Her carefully constructed test had exposed not weakness, but power that wasn't hers to control. The engineers began murmuring their congratulations, their whispers carrying not just respect, but a sense of astonishment. Derek, calm and composed, acknowledged them with a simple nod, leaving no trace of arrogance, only quiet authority. Victoria, observing from the edge of the room, realized the truth she had been avoiding. The balance had shifted, and Derek had proven that skill, patience, and integrity could rival even the most calculated authority. The battle was no longer about engines or titles. It was about influence, perception, and the unspoken power that emerges when competence meets opportunity. And Derek Carter, unaware of the ripples he had created, had just won another round. The day after Derek conquered the challenge, the atmosphere at Hamilton Industries had changed. Subtle yet undeniable. Conversations that had once revolved around strategy and deadlines now occasionally drifted toward whispers about the man who had effortlessly outshone expectations without demanding recognition. Derek's quiet mastery had become the new standard, and the office felt it, like an invisible tide reshaping the currents of influence. Engineers exchanged discreet glances across the room, nodding slightly when Derek passed by. Managers lingered in hallways, quietly observing his work, learning from his methodology without ever approaching him directly. The loyalty forming around him was silent but tangible, like a magnet pulling respect and admiration towards someone who didn't ask for it. Victoria could feel it everywhere. Emails copied to Derek, project updates paused for his input, subtle deference from her own assistants. Every gesture reinforced a growing truth. Her carefully maintained control was being challenged not by rebellion, but by skill. And it was unsettling. She walked through the office, heels clicking on the polished floor, her presence commanding attention as always. Yet even she noticed the subtle shifts. A hand that hesitated before asking her a question. An engineer who glanced at Derek before responding to her. Whispers that stopped abruptly when she approached. She felt the power dynamics slipping through her fingers, and it unnerved her more than she cared to admit. "Peter," she said later, calling her assistant into the office. "What is happening down there? People are behaving differently. Have you noticed?" Peter nodded, carefully choosing his words. "Yes, ma'am. Derek's methods. They're working. People respect him. Quietly, but consistently." Victoria's jaw tightened. Respect. Not fear. Not obligation. Respect. That was far more dangerous than any open defiance because it wasn't something she could command or manipulate. Derek's influence was organic, self-sustaining, and growing. Meanwhile, Derek remained oblivious to the undercurrents, focused solely on his work. A prototype needed adjustment, a schedule needed aligning, a machine required calibration. He moved through the office with calm efficiency, a steady presence that seemed to make chaos around him unnecessary. His consistency, patience, and mastery created a ripple effect, encouraging others to follow his lead naturally. Victoria's thoughts were restless, strategic gears turning in overdrive. She had tried tests, challenges, subtle intimidation, but each attempt only amplified Derek's credibility. The realization hit her. To undermine him, she would need to rethink her entire approach. A new strategy was required, one that balanced subtle pressure with observation, cunning, and foresight. From the corners of the office, whispers and glances multiplied. Employees shared stories of Derek's calm under pressure, his meticulous problem-solving, and the way he had navigated Victoria's tests without a single sign of frustration. The narrative was no longer simply about a mechanic doing his job. It had become a tale of quiet mastery prevailing in a world dominated by status and hierarchy. Victoria felt the tension building in her chest, a mixture of admiration and irritation she refused to show. She had encountered difficult employees before, rivals, competitors, even outright defiance, but Derek was different. He wasn't challenging her authority through aggression or rebellion. He was doing it through competence, patience, and an unwavering sense of self. And in that moment, as the office buzzed with hushed admiration for Derek and subtle anxiety for Victoria, one truth became undeniable. the game had evolved. It was no longer about a single incident or a test of skill. It was about influence, perception, and the unspoken power that emerges when respect is earned, quietly but irreversibly. Derek had no intention of seeking recognition, yet recognition followed him. Victoria had no intention of losing authority, yet authority was slipping in ways she had never anticipated. The tension between them was no longer a private battle. It was a silent war, one that would define the future of Hamilton Industries. Victoria Hamilton sat in her office late that evening, the city lights shimmering like countless judgmental eyes below. The events of the past week played in her mind. Derek's calm mastery of the prototype, the subtle loyalty forming among her employees, the whispers that spread like wildfire through Hamilton Industries. She had tried tests, subtle manipulations, even engineered small obstacles, but nothing had shaken him. Nothing had broken his composure. She tapped her fingers against the glass desk, her mind racing. One thing was clear: subtlety was no longer sufficient. If she wanted to reclaim her authority, she needed to escalate the situation. A public challenge, visible to all employees, undeniable in its stakes. Something that would test Derek in front of everyone. Something that would reveal whether his quiet mastery could withstand scrutiny under pressure. The plan began to take shape. A high-stakes demonstration, a project with tight deadlines and complex requirements, would be presented in the company's main atrium. Executives, engineers, and staff from multiple departments would gather to witness it. Victoria would frame it as a test of skill and leadership, but the real intent was to challenge Derek's growing influence, to assert that while competence was admirable, authority was ultimate. Meanwhile, Derek continued his work, completely unaware of the storm brewing above him. Each adjustment to the engine, each calibration of the prototype, was performed with the same focus and precision that had earned him quiet respect. Colleagues approached him for guidance, and he offered it generously, never boasting, never claiming credit. The effect was subtle but powerful. He became a beacon of competence and calm, naturally drawing admiration and loyalty. Victoria watched the staff, observed their reactions, and noted how Derek's influence had solidified. Even her own assistants were quietly aligning with him, unconsciously acknowledging his authority. She realized that the upcoming public challenge had to be flawless. Every detail had to be calculated, every variable controlled. If Derek succeeded, the admiration for him would surge further. If he faltered, she could reclaim the narrative. The morning of the event arrived. The atrium was filled with employees, the hum of whispered speculation buzzing through the air. Derek entered calmly, nodding to colleagues without breaking stride, unaware that this demonstration was a stage set by Victoria to confront him publicly. She stood at the podium, her presence commanding the room, and announced the challenge with carefully measured words. "This demonstration," she began, her voice echoing in the atrium, "will test not only technical skill but leadership under scrutiny. We will see who can meet these high standards and maintain composure when all eyes are on them." She scanned the crowd, letting her gaze rest momentarily on Derek, measuring, calculating, anticipating the impact. Derek listened silently, his expression neutral, his posture relaxed. There was no hesitation, no sign of intimidation, no trace of fear. The calm confidence that had defined him all week remained intact, and the employees sensed it immediately. Whispers spread, "He's calm. He's unshaken. He's going to handle this." Victoria's plan was in motion. She had created a crucible, a public trial meant to challenge not just skill but influence. The employees watched with anticipation, sensing the tension, waiting to see if Derek's quiet mastery could withstand this overt scrutiny. And as the demonstration began, the air seemed to pulse with expectation, admiration, and unspoken tension. Derek stepped forward, tools in hand, focused entirely on the task. Every movement precise, every decision deliberate, every gesture calm. The employees leaned in, captivated by his composure, inspired by his competence. And Victoria, standing at the edge of the stage she had set, realized that she had initiated a battle she was no longer certain she could control. The atrium was silent, charged with expectation. Employees, executives, and department heads all fixed their eyes on Derek Carter. Victoria Hamilton stood at the edge of the stage, her presence sharp and commanding, but even she felt the subtle shift of energy in the room. Derek's calm focus radiated confidence that was impossible to ignore. He approached the prototype engine with steady hands, surveying the complex machinery that Victoria had carefully framed as a public test. Every detail had been designed to challenge him under scrutiny, every adjustment meant to expose a flaw. Yet Derek didn't flinch. There was no hesitation, no sign of doubt. He moved methodically, diagnosing the issues with precision, anticipating problems before they could manifest, correcting each anomaly with quiet authority. The employees leaned in, their whispers hushed to awed silence. Some exchanged looks, realizing they were witnessing more than a demonstration of technical skill. They were seeing the embodiment of calm mastery under pressure. Derek didn't seek attention, yet attention followed him, drawn irresistibly by the clarity of his competence. Victoria observed with a mixture of fascination and frustration. Her plan to challenge him publicly, to assert authority and reestablish dominance, had inadvertently created a stage for Derek to shine. Every adjustment he made, every subtle correction, amplified the admiration in the room. The narrative was no longer hers to control. She had tried to orchestrate a test, but the result was undeniable. Derek's skill, patience, and composure had rewritten the story in real time. Minutes passed, yet the tension didn't break. Derek worked steadily, his movements precise, every action deliberate. The prototype, once deliberately destabilized, now hummed smoothly, performing beyond even the highest expectations. The crowd exhaled in collective astonishment. Engineers who had been skeptical nodded subtly. Colleagues whispered praise. Derek's quiet authority now carried the weight of undeniable achievement. Victoria felt a flicker of unease she could not suppress. The public challenge had been intended to assert her control, to remind everyone where ultimate authority lay. Instead, it had elevated Derek in a way that words alone could not convey. Respect, admiration, and quiet loyalty were coalescing around him, and she could feel her influence waning, not through defiance, but through the simple, unassailable truth of his competence. Derek stepped back from the engine, wiped his hands, and nodded subtly at the team. No flourish, no showmanship, just calm acknowledgement. The room erupted in subdued applause, not out of obligation, but out of genuine admiration. Derek hadn't performed for them. He had simply done his job, and in doing so, he had shifted the entire dynamic of the office. Victoria, usually unshakable, studied him closely. Every subtle gesture, every movement, every calm breath seemed to emphasize the contrast between her authority and his skill. She had designed the crucible, yet he had mastered it flawlessly, and the employees had witnessed it all. The narrative she had tried to control had escaped her grasp, replaced by the undeniable reality of Derek's quiet power. For the first time, she realized that authority based on intimidation or manipulation could be challenged, even in her world. Derek didn't fight, he simply excelled. And excellence, when executed with integrity, had a weight that no hierarchical position could easily counteract. As the crowd dispersed, Derek returned to his workspace with quiet confidence, leaving behind a room filled with silent respect and admiration. Victoria lingered, a storm of strategy and contemplation brewing in her mind. The battle for influence had entered a new phase, and she knew the next moves would require careful planning. Derek had proven that skill, patience, and integrity could rival authority, and perhaps even surpass it. Victoria Hamilton paced her office late into the night, the city lights stretching endlessly outside her window. The public demonstration had been flawless, but not for her. Derek Carter had taken her meticulously designed challenge and turned it into a spectacle of quiet mastery, leaving her authority subtly diminished in the eyes of the employees. The ripple effect of respect and admiration surrounding him was growing, and she knew that if she didn't act soon, it would continue to strengthen. Her mind raced. Subtle tests had failed, a public challenge had backfired, and her influence was beginning to erode in ways that mere oversight could no longer control. She needed a plan that was more sophisticated, more intricate, a test that would push Derek into uncharted territory, where precision and adaptability were crucial, and where the stakes would be undeniable. It couldn't be about skill alone. It had to combine ingenuity, leadership, and pressure that even Derek could not anticipate. Meanwhile, Derek moved through the company with his usual quiet confidence. Colleagues approached him for guidance, managers deferred to his judgment, and engineers sought his advice without hesitation. What Victoria did not notice was the subtle network of loyalty forming around him, a network built on respect, shared admiration, and the realization that he consistently delivered excellence without ego or fanfare. Derek did not seek followers, yet influence naturally gravitated toward him, creating a foundation of trust and subtle power that no hierarchy could easily dismantle. Victoria began to orchestrate her next move. The upcoming challenge would involve a multi-department project with high visibility, requiring real-time problem-solving, technical precision, and public presentation. Every department would be watching. Every executive would be evaluating. And Derek would have to navigate this labyrinth flawlessly or face consequences that could no longer be managed quietly. She outlined the scenario meticulously. A prototype requiring cross-department coordination, intentionally embedded errors and unexpected malfunctions, and the presence of visiting clients and board members to raise the stakes. The goal was clear: to challenge Derek in a way that tested not just skill, but adaptability, composure, and leadership under immense pressure. If he succeeded, the admiration for him could no longer be contained. If he faltered, Victoria could reclaim authority and restore her dominance over the narrative. The following morning, the company floor buzzed with anticipation. Engineers whispered, managers exchanged glances, and employees speculated about what Victoria had planned. Derek approached his workstation with the same calm demeanor, tools in hand, completely focused on the task at hand. He had no idea that the next challenge would push him further than any before, that every subtle obstacle and hidden complication had been designed to test not only his skill, but his patience and judgment under scrutiny. As Victoria observed from her office, she allowed herself a brief, controlled smile. The challenge was set, the stakes were high, and the next phase of their silent battle had begun. Yet even as she prepared to watch him navigate this new trial, a subtle unease lingered. Derek's quiet authority had already shifted the culture of the company. His calm mastery had won him respect. And now, in the crucible she had designed, Victoria understood that every move she made could either reinforce her position or further elevate the man who had quietly, steadily, and undeniably changed the rules of the game. The stakes were higher than ever. The challenge had begun. And in the tension-filled air of Hamilton Industries, one truth was clear. Derek Carter was no ordinary mechanic, and the company and Victoria herself would never be the same. The atrium was alive with anticipation, every corner crowded with employees, executives, and visiting clients. Derek Carter stood at the center of it all, tools in hand, calm as ever. The challenge Victoria Hamilton had designed was complex, far more intricate than anything he had faced before. It wasn't just a test of mechanical skill. It was a trial of leadership, coordination, and composure under the watchful eyes of the entire company. From her vantage point above, Victoria observed him carefully. She had orchestrated a situation where every department's work intersected, where deliberate errors were hidden within the prototype, and where unexpected malfunctions could arise at any moment. The setup was designed to expose weaknesses, to place Derek under intense scrutiny. Yet even as she watched, she sensed a troubling truth. He remained unshaken, composed, and focused. Derek began by assessing the situation with methodical precision. He scanned the prototype, noting discrepancies and potential failures. He called over engineers from multiple departments, guiding them with calm, confident instructions. His tone was quiet but authoritative. It inspired trust rather than fear, cooperation rather than compliance. Where others might have hesitated under pressure, Derek's steady focus encouraged them to perform at their best. The first complication arose within minutes. A misaligned component threatened to halt the process entirely. Victoria watched, anticipating a flinch, a sign of frustration, but Derek approached it calmly. He instructed the team clearly, delegating tasks efficiently, and corrected the misalignment with deliberate hands. The engineers followed his lead instinctively, their respect for his skill evident in their eagerness to cooperate. Victoria's strategy was meant to test his limits, yet every obstacle only seemed to reinforce Derek's competence. A sudden system error appeared, designed to create confusion. Derek paused, analyzed the problem, and addressed it systematically, turning what was intended as a trap into a demonstration of control. Every action was precise, deliberate, and confident, leaving no room for doubt. The crowd watched in awe. Employees whispered, clients murmured in astonishment, and even executives exchanged looks that betrayed their admiration. Derek's calm under pressure, his ability to guide and inspire those around him, transformed the challenge from a potential failure into a showcase of mastery and leadership. Victoria felt a shift in her chest, a mixture of frustration and admiration she couldn't hide. The public challenge, designed to assert her authority, had instead magnified Derek's influence. Every miscalculation she had embedded was neutralized not through luck, but through skill and composure. The narrative was no longer hers to control. Derek was writing it silently, one precise action at a time. Hours passed, and the demonstration continued flawlessly. Derek not only resolved every complication but also coordinated the team's efforts with a level of efficiency and grace that left the room captivated. Victoria realized the truth she had been avoiding. This man had earned the respect and loyalty of the entire floor, not through ambition or ego, but through competence, integrity, and quiet confidence. As the final adjustments were made, and the prototype performed beyond expectations, the atrium erupted in subdued applause. Derek, calm and collected, nodded subtly to the team, acknowledging their efforts without taking overt credit. His mastery was complete, and in that moment, Victoria understood something profound. Authority could be challenged, influence could be shifted, and respect, once earned, could never truly be commanded. The public challenge was over, but the war for influence had entered a new phase. Derek had not only faced the most sophisticated test Victoria could design, he had excelled. And now, the company would never view him or the power dynamics around him the same way again. The aftermath of the public challenge hung in the air like electricity. The atrium, once a neutral space, now bore witness to a subtle yet undeniable shift in power. Derek Carter, calm and composed, had not only completed Victoria Hamilton's most sophisticated test, but had done so with a mastery that left no room for dispute. The employees, clients, and executives had seen it all. The respect for him was palpable, growing silently but steadily like a force that could not be contained. Across the floor, teams began to approach him with ideas, questions, and collaboration requests. Where before they might have hesitated, now they sought his guidance openly, eager to learn, to contribute, and to be part of the quiet authority he embodied. Derek didn't command them, he inspired them. His calm decisiveness had turned admiration into loyalty, skill into influence, and presence into power. Victoria observed from the edge, a storm of emotions churning within her. Her public challenge, designed to reassert dominance, had instead amplified Derek's reputation. Each moment of his competence had shifted the narrative, drawing the eyes and trust of the employees toward him. The subtle hierarchy she had maintained for years was unraveling, thread by thread, before her eyes. She took a deep breath, forcing herself to maintain composure. Authority, she reminded herself, was not just about competence. It was about perception, control, and timing. But perception, in this case, was irrevocably altered. Derek's quiet mastery had rewritten the rules, demonstrating that integrity and skill could hold more weight than traditional authority or intimidation. From the corners of the room, whispers turned to discussions. Engineers exchanged nods, managers subtly deferred to Derek's judgment, and employees shared quiet stories of his calm efficiency. Allies emerged naturally, drawn not by command, but by trust, competence, and the undeniable magnetism of his consistent performance. Victoria could see it happening, and it unsettled her more than she expected. Derek, unaware of the subtle storm around him, returned to his workspace with his usual calm. He continued to check systems, make adjustments, and guide the team with quiet authority. His focus never wavered, yet every action reinforced the loyalty and respect he had quietly earned. The company's culture had shifted, the influence network had strengthened, and the balance of power had subtly but permanently changed. Victoria remained, arms crossed, silently analyzing the aftermath. She understood now that influence could not be forced, control could not be imposed, and respect could not be demanded. It had to be earned. Derek had done exactly that. The public challenge, intended to assert her dominance, had revealed a deeper truth. Some forces could not be contained by hierarchy or intimidation alone. By the end of the day, the atrium emptied, leaving behind a transformed workspace. Derek's reputation as a calm, competent, and unshakable figure was cemented. Victoria, though still powerful in title, recognized the quiet but irrevocable shift in dynamics. The war for influence was no longer a simple game of tests and challenges. It had evolved into a subtle, permanent reshaping of authority, and Derek Carter had proven, without a word of defiance, that true power could emerge quietly, firmly, and undeniably. In that moment, both understood, though in different ways, that nothing would ever be the same at Hamilton Industries. Derek had not only survived the challenge, he had redefined the rules of influence, skill, and respect. And Victoria, for the first time, faced the reality that the narrative she once controlled was now shared, and perhaps, in ways even dominated by the quiet authority of a man who simply knew how to master every situation with patience, precision, and integrity.